Ann Wallace is the Director of Programs at the Funder Network, where Ann manages working groups and regional networks, staffs the Green Working Group, and serves on the Governance Committee and Grant Selection Committee for the Partners for Places program. Before joining the Funders Network, Ann facilitated the planning and design of smart growth collaboratives in Vermont and Massachusetts. We're also joined by Rachel Leon, the Executive Director of the Park Foundation based in Ithaca, New York. Rachel has extensive experience in the Park Foundation's focus areas, which include democracy, media, environment, social justice, and sustainability. Prior to joining the foundation in 2020, she had held leadership positions for more than 25 years, most recently as the Executive Director at the Environmental Grantmakers Association. Thank you again for joining us today, both of you. Without further ado, Rachel, please take it away.
Thanks, Liz. And we can keep this pretty informal too. So if I say anything that you don't understand or you want to ask a question, just jump in like Judy just did so beautifully to make sure it was being recorded. So really excited to be here with Ann. And I was just with you all. My brother ran the Boston Marathon yesterday. So I'm feeling I was like, oh, if this was just not still the pandemic, we could all have just been sitting around a table having lunch together, but hopefully soon. So felt the incredible spirit and really enjoyed just seeing the miracle that is the Boston Marathon. So kind of like climate change and all of the challenges that we're facing, it can seem impossible and just such a huge thing to achieve. And then you watch people from all across the globe and every color and every age. And, it was just amazing. I've been before, but anyway, it's a reminder that we can do anything if we do it together. So I'm feeling inspired, although my brother was hurt. So I also saw the agony and the challenge, watching someone usually have an amazing time I was tracking him and seeing his time get slower and slower. So also relates to the challenges we face. They're big and, there's a lot of roadblocks in the way. And so I don't want to make it sound easy because it's definitely not. It's a big challenge. So, but happy to be with you today. And I feel like I am sort of wearing both hats. I think Denise Porcher may have suggested me from the work that I was so deeply involved with at Environmental Grantmakers Association for so many years. And so I'll probably spend, I'll touch on that, especially as you guys work as a group trying to help funders and, strategize and collaborate and keep evolving on these issues. So I'll focus most of my brief thoughts there. But I also, I'm really excited. About a year ago, I shifted from being the executive director at Environmental Grantmaker, where I was for more than a decade, to the Park Foundation, which is based in Ithaca. And what's great about Park is they fund in environment and democracy, they fund climate change, and then they have these really strong, incredible local programs on social justice and sustainable Ithaca. So it's a foundation where really it has these boots on the ground and funds locally, but then also funds, I didn't say media either, a big focus on in national issues that are a lot of the crises that we're confronting. So it's great to be at Park and be able to both be working more locally again, which helps me if you have some questions. I know it's hard sometimes to think about how to enter the environmental grant making sphere, and it can feel so big and challenging. And so it's fun again to be sort of both working very locally, but also thinking about the global challenges ahead. So just feel very privileged where I am now. To be working with such a great group of people who do such great grant making, but also deep love for environmental grant makers, where probably most relates to what you're going to be doing. Well, they both relate actually to what you're going to be doing. It sounds like after we have this conversation, you're going to go right in and be doing some regranting and some environmental justice grant making, which is awesome. So I think that's terrific, and hope that anything I share is helpful. But I guess I thought I'd just do a couple of big picture points. And Ann, you're really blessed when you hear from Ann that she both works with one of these wonderful collaborative affinity groups, but also is local, right? So you have local knowledge and wisdom to share. So I'll probably keep mine bigger picture, but I guess some of the questions that Phil asked me to address are, it is sort of overwhelming what's happening. I mean, we are dealing with these cascading crises. So It's like, democracy, climate change, inequality, a racial reckoning. You know, how is it that we take our little pieces of philanthropy and try to make them add up to more than the sum of its parts when you're dealing with such really big, thorny, challenging problems? And, you know, I think the answer is you just jump in, but you try to do it, you know, in community, in collaboration, and really listening to the people that are most impacted by what's happening. So if you look at Environmental Grantmakers Association, it's really interesting because it's gone through a lot of changes in the last, it's been around, it started in about 1986, and really was in the beginning much more traditionally focused on species and land preservation and biodiversity, and really has gone through quite an evolution, as most, really every philanthropy affinity group is grappling with. But you really saw EGA switch from being very sort of planet focused to really starting to think more about people, place, and planet. And I think that's something that philanthropy in general is reckoning with and trying to do. And you see it in the funding cycle. So if you look at the EGA's members give about $2 billion a year to different environmental priorities. And it used to be biodiversity and land preservation was number one and the bulk of the funding. And then there were, you know, little tiny bits. And when you got down to environmental justice, it was less than 1% of the funding. Now, when you look at climate change and energy and transportation funding together, they actually now equal about 25% of EGA's members. So that's over 200 environmental funders give about 25% of their funding to climate change, energy, and transportation, and about 25% of the dollars go to biodiversity and land preservation. So that's a real shift in the last decade. You've seen biodiversity funding going down, and climate change and energy and transportation fund going up. And you have seen environmental justice funding also really increasing, although still a very small part of the pie. So don't think we're there yet. And you've seen more commitments than action. I think we saw, you know, hundreds of foundations coming out after the George Floyd murder, and in this sort of racial reckoning frame that we've been in, making commitments and talking about Black Lives Matter, which in itself, I mean, was significant, but the moving from the words to action is a longer and a forever evolution, really. So I'm happy to take questions or talk about sort of the evolution that EGA went through and is still very much going through. And EGA has its first Black woman president, which is very exciting. So part of the transitions and change and how you evolve on these issues is you leave too. So me leaving EGA opened up even a chance for, and now TFN is the same, the Funders Network. I mean, actually all of and then the biodiversity funders group are all led by Black women now, which is a pretty incredible thing. But again, your leader is not as Tamara would tell you, and the other leaders would tell you that, you know, they don't want to be a figurehead. I mean, you need to see change institutionally in the boards, in the grant making, and, you know, and from, you know, whole, you know, cloth. And at EGA, when I was at EGA, we actually shifted about halfway through my tenure. The board became majority people of color, and our staff shifted quite a bit to about half people of color under my leadership. And the grant making started to shift, but boy, that was probably the slowest. So let's see, I already see a question, so I'll look at that while I'm talking. Oh, sure. So one question is, what are the motivating factors or changes that moved funders to focus more on climate change, energy, transportation, and less on biodiversity? So it's interesting, I think, because biodiversity is still a massive challenge, right? It's not like, I mean, this is where it gets hard. And when you're trying to think about where funding should go, because I mean, just last week, we got new reports out about the loss of birds and, you know, and all the losses on species. So really we need more money everywhere. I mean, so I'm certainly not out saying let's give less to biodiversity and more to climate change. I think the difference is that climate change now it's an existential threat to our existence. And it is, I mean, really all of these things mean the same thing. I mean, you can fund biodiversity and address climate change, and you can fund climate change and address biodiversity. But what you have seen, I think, as a shift is that for many, many years, funders really were focused on, preserving land and, preserving lakes. And we're not necessarily thinking about how all of those things interrelate with people and then thinking about what's coming with climate change and what's next. So there's sort of, I mean, there's mitigation and adaptation. There's all these different strategies about how you actually try to deal with the challenges that are facing our environment. So I think it's a positive that you're seeing funding shifting and spreading across more areas. I don't think but I do think that biodiversity funding needs more funding too. And again, philanthropy is only a small piece of the pie. So I guess the other way to look at it is that there are, philanthropy alone can't solve this, but no matter what, if you fund arts and culture, if you fund healthcare, if you fund whatever your program area is or your foundation is focused on, there are aspects of climate change and racial justice and democracy, frankly, at this point, that are all interwoven and interconnected. So it might be a stretch for you to fund a specific project around a lake, but there's no doubt that you could be funding in the climate change arena in any area that you're funding in. And some of the arts and culture funding is honestly, in my view, from what I've seen in my decades of this, some of the most powerful change has come from culture change. They say culture beats strategy, or what is it? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I mean, so getting the culture to shift can be some of the most profound change. So I mean, in that essence, you might see less in biodiversity, straight up, land preservation. But if you can convince the public that climate change is real and get the next generation, really engaged in this, you're doing your work. So there's just a lot of different ways to deal with this. Another question, is this the golden age for collaboration with government? Yeah, well, so there are that's something I'm thinking a lot about from my lens at the Park Foundation. So I do think, depending on what passes, like something that I've been tracking a lot is like this Climate Conservation Corps. So that's an example of the Sunrise Movement organizers, youth movement on the ground saying, we want to see Climate Conservation Corps in any kind of infrastructure or reconciliation package that comes out. And if that happens, then I think there's going to be a big role for philanthropy in trying to make sure that in whatever community you're in, that you help bring that to reality if it gets through. And I'm sure Anne can talk about other things like Justice 40 and a lot of efforts that, or even water. I mean, I guess one other big picture comment I'll make is that we talk about climate change and climate crisis, but water to me is sort of the next climate. And you're also seeing, so if you look at the funding stream, you see water behind climate and energy, but you see that growing too. And so if you think about where you fund and what you're funding, and even if it has nothing to do with climate change, but if people don't have clean drinking water, and if there's lead in the schools and you're funding education and the kids can't drink out of the drinking fountain at school, which is a crisis across the country, I think in the future we're going to be talking about water, not as much about climate change. And because literally, I mean, you can't survive without water, and we're going to get to some really challenging times with that. So I mean, the other thing I see in the chat, which I was going to mention, so as a philanthropy, and this is a place where I'm really proud of at Park and at EGA, so part of the evolution was to think about people, place, and planet, and to try to center racial equity and really think about how to advance environmental, what does solutions look like and what does progress look like? And as foundations, one of the biggest things you can do is take a look at your grant making and then look at your endowments and see if those two are in complete conflict. And so EGA for many years, there have many foundations that were really out in the forefront around the need to divest, and Park Foundation has divested from fossil fuels and is actually doing incredibly well. So I think you've seen what started as there were a few foundations experimenting and were really considered like on the edge. And now you see, institution after institution. So Harvard in your backyard, and a number of colleges reacting to students saying that they want, insisting on divestment, that you're starting to see a real shift there. If we could, moving the needle on divestment is massive and can be much more significant even than any grant making that we do. So there's a lot of different tools in philanthropy, I think, to deal with these crises. And let's see, was I going to say anything else before I'll switch it to Anne, because she can give you much more. I heard an interesting, I was a part of an ally workshop last week, and they were talking about sort of the 3 steps. So how do you go from having a conversation like climate change is real, and, we should be doing more grant making in it, and, we should be confronting racial equity, to actually doing it. And the 3 steps that they laid out that I thought were interesting were like, number 1, analysis, number 2, action, and then number 3 was healing, like internal healing. So that, I think that's something that our organizations don't think of a lot, but if you think about trying to work with your trustees and your foundations to really shift both where the grant making is and potentially things like where the endowments are, you're really talking about culture change within your institution. And so you really do need to think about all 3 of those things, thinking about, learning first and understanding where you are, and then think about action. How do you shift? How do you actually add some grant making in this arena? And then, but don't forget that as an institution, both as staff, as your trustees, and in the community that you're in, that there's probably some healing that needs to happen. And that can take a variety of different forms. But that's something we've been thinking about too. How do we think about what is our role and what our foundation has been a part in this? Because most money is not made in pretty ways. And so thinking about for your own foundation and your trustees, how could that be a piece of what you do in your work? I think is a really holistic way to think about this. I was going to just tell you one thing I'm doing at Park, and one reason why I do think it's really important to be involved with groups like EGA or TFN is when I came to Park, the trustees are like, well, we do great grassroots grant making, and they do. They helped, the ban on fracking come to life in New York. They were one of the few funders that was funding grassroots groups when most foundations saw gas as a bridge away from coal, and so they were fine with fracking. Park was really bold in its grant making then, but it was mostly white-led groups just because of the geography. But what we're doing is working with EGA to actually take all of our grants and then apply a lens and take the data from Candid and the Foundation Center and EGA, and then look at the demographics data, look at the budget size data, so that we can actually look at our own grant making and say, okay, so right now, 5% of our grants go to people of color-led organizations or to organizations whose mission is racial equity and it's authentic. And then we're trying to think about how to set internal goals. But the first thing we need to do is understand where we are, because you can think you're one way, but when you actually look at your grants, it can be a rude awakening. So we're doing that, and we couldn't do that without a group like EGA, where you can compare yourself to the field and use data to really be smart, and then work from there. So anyway, that's just how we're approaching it. And then we're also going to be we're an all white staff. So it's strange for me to go from the, world I helped create at EGA to then a place that is much whiter again. And it's partially geography, but it's also partially that we're in a different part of the continuum. And so I'm sort of starting anew at a family foundation where, we have some work to do. And so we're going to be working both institutionally as a staff and as trustees and in our grant making to continue this evolution. But what's awesome about the Park Foundation where I am is that, our trustee wakes up every day and is like, climate change, like, what can we do? And, who can we fund that is on the ground, working on solutions. And so I think there's a lot of amazing groups now, and there's a lot of amazing intermediaries and re-granters too. So it's not like 10 or 15 years ago, it was a lot harder to figure out where to start. Now there are so many great groups on the ground and so many great intermediaries that there's a lot of paths to get going on this, and no time like the present, I guess I would say. So I'll stop there. But happy to answer any questions or wait for Ann to talk and then ask questions together.
Thanks, Rachel. Any questions at this point?
I can also send the reports. There's a new study out by ClimateWorks yesterday that talks about how climate funding is now 2% of philanthropy. It's been increasing, but they can't seem to get past like a couple of percentage points. That's in the whole field of philanthropy. And then I have the executive summary of the new EGA report if people are interested. So I can give those to Phil and he can share those with you.
Thanks, that would be wonderful. Okay, if there are no more questions at this time, we can move on to Ann's portion of the presentation.
Okay, well, there were a million questions I had for you, Rachel, but maybe we can sort of follow that up in the sort of Q&A. So first of all, it's really great to be with everybody here. I'm Ann Wallace. I'm the Director of Programs at the Funders Network. And for 15 years, I was a partner at Grants Management, GMA Foundations. So where I ran the environmental grant making program. So it feels like I'm coming home here. But the Funders Network is a 22-year-old network. We call ourselves now Philanthropy Serving Organizations, PSOs. And as Rachel mentioned, we have new leadership at the Funders Network. So Patricia Smith is our CEO and president. And when Pat came on, we went through a strategic planning process, as often happens with funder networks. And we sort of revamped our way of working and to some degree, the language in terms of our mission and vision statements. So, our mission is to leverage philanthropy's unique potential to help create communities and regions that are sustainable, prosperous, healthy, and just for all people. And the vision is to create generations of courageous philanthropic leaders who are engaged, emboldened, and equipped to bring about a just society. And this includes increasing representation of people of color in philanthropic leadership positions. So at the Funders Network, when we were created as an interdisciplinary, an organization that was going to look at the environment, community development, equity sort of as of a whole. So we always have had that approach. Equity has always been a kind of core component of what we do. But during the strategic planning process that we went through, we really sort of reaffirmed that it's really our leading value at the Funders Network. And so as we've started to operationalize our new strategic plan, we've developed what we call a strategic and racial equity frameworks document. And that really lays out sort of a racial equity action plan that we're moving forward at the organization. So our organizational strategies run from putting equity first, sharing knowledge, building leadership, fostering collaboration, investing strategically, seeking impact, and then amplifying impact. On our program strategy side, we have, as I mentioned, implementing our racial equity action plan. A big component of what we do is around field building and knowledge sharing with philanthropy. We are also launching a new program element, which we're calling Communities of Practice, which is sort of deeper dive into some might be skill building, sort of strategy organized, could be place-based. We launched a systems transformation and network collaboration community of practice this past spring and summer. And we're going to be deepening that work going forward, as well as looking at some additional communities of practice. We've also had a really terrific leadership development program. The acronym is PLACES. It's bringing together philanthropic leaders to really deepen their own expertise and work with peers around racial equity and the issues that we work with at the Funders Network. And we have, I think we have 160 graduates now of the PLACES program. And it's been amazing because it's not just about, the building the skills of these individuals, and then hopefully they are helping build the skills within their own institutions, but it's also provided a huge pipeline of amazing leaders that we've been able to engage at the Funders Network in a lot of different ways. For example, our board chair is one of our PLACES fellows, Craig Martinez at the California Endowment. So as we think about our work in the sort of field building and knowledge sharing area, we do the annual conference, your learning webinars, your blogs, social media, and then we have a number of very active funder working groups. The majority of them are sort of issue focused. So one is focused on kind of climate and sustainability practice, another on urban water issues. A third is looking at inclusive economic development. And then we have some place-based as well. We have a very active group of funders in California called Smart Growth California. It includes Los Angeles Funder Collaborative and the San Joaquin Valley Funder Collaborative. And we have an Intermountain West Funder Network that we've been managing for the last 10 years. And then on the sort of collaborations and partnership side of things, we manage a matching grant program. It's called Partners for Places. I'm very involved and have been involved since the very beginning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's a matching grant program that's itself a partnership with an organization called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is a peer-to-peer network of local government sustainability directors from the US and Canada. And we have a number of national investors that have helped create the program and support the program. And we support some really cool projects sort of at the local community level. We also, in the sort of partnership side of things, and collaborations, we have a Mobility and Access Collaborative, which is a group of funders that have come together because of their concerns about public, basically investing in public transportation and alternative transportation, because transportation is now our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And we're not doing so well at bringing that down as we have in other areas. So that's a particular focus of that group of funders. And then we have a cohort of community foundations and regional associations of grant makers that are focused on philanthropic preparedness for kind of emergencies, climate emergencies and disasters. And that's a group that's been working together as a cohort for the last 7 years. And that's funded by the Margaret A. Cargill Foundation. So we do lots of different things at the Funders Network. And, I would say climate and environmental justice shows up across the board in our work, but particularly most deeply in terms of some of our funder working groups. So this green working group that I mentioned, our Smart Growth California, as everybody probably knows, California is an incredible leader on climate and energy issues, and our Urban Water Funders group, and then through our Partners for Places grant program and the Mobility and Access Collaborative. So I'll just say a couple more words about Partners for Places. So as I mentioned, this is a matching grant program. So the idea is that we're trying to create sort of an incentive for local government sustainability or water offices to work with local philanthropy and to work with community leaders, frontline community leaders, to identify some project work that they'd like to be doing together, and that helps advance climate sustainability practices, but also provides direct benefits to frontline communities, and helps support the leadership development and hopefully the building of greater power in frontline communities. So we're in our 10th year. We really revamped the program. I'd say just about 2 years ago, where our governance committee we'd been funding a lot of really great work, but felt like we really wanted to center the focus on racial equity much more strongly within Partners for Places. So we revamped the program, and we basically, the partnership became a partnership where frontline community-led organizations were fully part of the partnership with local funders and local government leaders. And the applications now need to address that directly. There needs to be a racial equity analysis. There needs to be a project that demonstrates direct benefit to frontline communities as part of the work. So it's something that Rachel said reminded me that we're now about not just the what, but the how. So the process of how you're building those relationships and trying to advance what some of us might call collaborative governance strategies is where we are moving in terms of Partners for Places. the other thing that we've done is that we've added another element, which is a mini grant program, which is sort of early stage, smaller grants that's really helping build the capacity so that those partners at the community level can come together and really build relationships and trust. If a racial equity analysis is something that would be helpful, or training that would be helpful at that stage, we support that. And then help them identify projects and things that they'd like to work on together going forward that could then be the focus of a larger application to the larger grant program. So I think I'll sort of stop there in terms of the Partners for Places. And I think there's a lot of threads of things that Rachel brought up and that Phil sort of posed in a series of kind of questions when he helped prep us that might be interesting for sort of further conversation.
Great, thanks, Anne. Shall we move into the general Q&A then? Feel free to unmute yourselves and you can just sing out any questions that you have or put them in the chat if that's easier for you.
I'm interested, Anne, in your members. You know, there were so many groups that came out and did public statements after George Floyd. And then how do you think your members have been doing in terms of new commitments that sort of connect, you know, environment, climate change, and racial equity? What are you seeing?
I mean, I think we're seeing that TFN, what, you know, EGA has been seeing, which is that there's been a much more concerted effort, I think, on the part of philanthropy to think about sort of a broader approach to the work, so that we're connecting, you know, the racial justice issues to climate justice, to health equity issues, and to economic justice, which really brings together a lot of the issues that TFN and, you know, the Biden-Harris administration is talking about a whole of government approach to this work and really addressing all of those factors. And, you know, I think we need a whole of philanthropy approach as well. So that's something that, you know, so how is that, how are we really seeing that? We're seeing that in terms of, you know, changes in the grant making. I think that's slow, as Rachel said, but we're also seeing a number of our funders that are helping invest in intermediaries where the dollars are either being spent, the decisions related to how those dollars are being spent by movement leaders or grassroots or frontline leaders or in partnership with funders. So different kinds of approaches. In one of our members, the George Gunn Foundation, is in Cleveland, and they've just established basically a fund that's going to support climate work that's led by communities of color leaders. And that's something we're going to be featuring at our annual conference. So I'd happen to know a little bit about it, but we're seeing a lot of that. And I think EGA at the EGA annual conference last week was just really lifting up that there are just an amazing amount of sort of new innovations that are out there. And you know, some of it's around trust-based philanthropy, and some of it's around really trying to move the decision-making down to leaders of color.
Bill, do you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say, and let me know if I'm not coming through because I hear my connection's terrible as usual, but we have a lot of funders who actually go pretty deep on inequity and go deep on neighborhoods, and therefore are sort of more comfortable with racial inclusion than maybe, you know, the old environmental group, which has changed. But I think we're already there in the neighborhoods, and we kind of are trying to promote local leadership, but are not particularly strong in the field of environment. And I don't know if you have any encouragement for funders like that, and there are quite a few of them in Boston. And actually, once you count the Barr Foundation, not so many strong environmental funders.
One thing that I was thinking of immediately, I'd be interested in Rachel's comments, is that, you know, it's not that we need necessarily environmental organizations to be in these communities, but we need to support these community-based groups to take on environment or climate justice as part of the work that they're doing. So I mean, we also need, the environmental community to, diversify its leadership. There's a lot of things we need to be doing, but I think that, when you work in community, you don't separate all these issues. I mean, the fact that, my neighborhood is flooding during a major rain event, oh, yes, I've got to deal with that. And oh, there's a climate component to that. There's a, injustice component in terms of where communities are living and how public sector has been responsive or not responsive in terms of infrastructure development in those communities. So just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention, I have this visceral memory when Sandy hit New York. And I mean, personally, didn't have power for 11 days. The office was shut for like 2.5 weeks. Like, it was wild to just see. And just in this recent storm, it's terrifying and horrific. The flooding that happened with, Hurricane Ida, that was really about New Orleans, but then hit, just like drowned families living in basements in Queens and in New Jersey on the roads. So, but I was in a Boston conference, I think at the Bar Foundation, where I think it was the mayor then, but he was talking about how if the tides had just been different, like Sandy would have hit Boston like straight on, it would have been catastrophic. So I think for foundations, thinking about, I just sort of did this talk with my trustees around every funder is a disaster funder now, which goes back to Anne was talking about some of the working groups they have on that. So I think some of the ways that foundations can be thinking about this is, even so, if you're good at funding neighborhood community groups, there is such a need to be thinking about the infrastructure, which is a big topic of conversation at the national level, and the resilience components, no matter where you live and where you fund now. The reality is, with more frequent storms and worsening storms and weakening infrastructure and all these other crises like roads and housing, and there's so much to fund that I think we used to give a grant like at the Park Foundation if there was a hurricane somewhere, and it was around a board meeting and we felt bad, but like one thing we did at this last board meeting was try to institutionalize thinking about it at least at one of our 4 board meetings a year, so that we're doing some grant making that addresses that, beyond geography, but really thinking about some solution-based grant making that will try to make more resilient beyond Ithaca, but, like for New York State and for the country. So I think that's one new frame that funders can think about. And so, the other thing is just the solutions, the fun stuff, the solutions front. If we're trying to shift from fossil fuels and from extraction, funding solar and funding wind, and I know wind can get particularly controversial around the Massachusetts and every area, honestly, as people start to think about their backyards or the oceans, but there's so many great solutions that if you start thinking about what's the next, what's the future that we want, and can we do some grant making around helping build that then relates to our program areas, I think there's some amazing stuff that can be focused on that's different than what we've done in the past.
Some of the things that we've funded, like through Partners for Places, in neighborhoods are, community gardenings and sort of green space work. We just made a grant to Rochester, New York, where they're actually, there's a partnership of a number of different organizations with the community gardens are actually managed by the staff at the Episcopal Church in the neighborhood. But those gardens are now going to shift ownership into a community land trust. So I think about, the work that's happened in Dudley Street neighborhood, for example, and the sort of community land trust model that was developed there. We also have funded a number of kind of climate resilience hubs that are really community focused on community resources and community buildings that make them more resilient. So they become sort of a hub for both should a disaster strike, there's resources there, renewable energy, solar, whatever, but also that they can become sort of teaching tools as well in the community. So one thing we didn't really talk about too much, but there's sort of this amazing focus right now in the Biden administration on climate and racial justice issues, and there's a number of different bills that are going through Congress, which of course I'm not advocating for anything right now, but to say that it looks like there's going to be some really significant money that's available at the federal level to be supporting this work. And there's a Biden executive order called the Justice 40 order, which basically says that any of the federal dollars that are going out for climate should, 40% of those resources should be invested in communities of color and disadvantaged communities. So we are seeing a lot of interest on funders in thinking about, one, how can they help build the capacity of their community-based grantees to help think about this, whether it's build the readiness to try to compete for some of those dollars or try to help direct where some of those dollars are going, because a lot of the money is going to go through states and localities. So I don't know, to what degree kind of funders in this group that have been thinking about those issues, but there's a federal policy piece, but there's also a really community capacity building component to that as well.
Something that I think would be helpful for our participants' discussion later this afternoon would perhaps be to hear from each of you about how you identify outstanding organizations to fund. Is there any particular criteria or hallmarks that you look for?
Particularly in that community capacity building vein that you just talked about, Anne.
Well, Rachel, you're the funder now.
Yeah, it's funny. It's both fun and hard to actually, so I'm also, in addition to being the executive director at Park, I'm the program person for the Sustainable Ithaca program. So it's been interesting to actually have to roll up my sleeve and do the local grant making. And, part of it is identifying and building new relationships and building capacity and then being responsive, but it is interesting because you sort of have to start where people are and then work from there. But so I guess we're doing a both and strategy is what I would say, because there are some great granters and intermediaries out there across the country. So I think one thing to do is to look at some of the funds that are focusing in these areas and the community groups that they've identified as doing stellar work. But there's also groups that haven't gotten on those lists yet that certainly deserve funding. So I think, we try to do it by figuring out, like with the Green New Deal, we fund efforts around the Green New Deal in Ithaca, which is really picking up steam now. And, all the environmental groups locally are working on it, but trying to connect them to the community groups who have a different stake in it and a different view of it. I do realize that philanthropy has a role beyond just writing checks. Part of it is creating convenings and space and making sure that some of the community groups are part of the process. That's not about us without us, is whatever that phase is. I'm finding that in the place-based work that I'm helping with now, there's some of that preliminary work that you have to do to make sure that groups are even at the table to think about and learn about, and then get them to be able to be eligible to be grantees in your foundation. I think there's disparities and there is structural racism kind of baked in. So sometimes you do have to do extra work and extra vetting and really reaching out because folks don't see themselves in that arena, even though they're doing great work that could use your support. So I think it's anyway, it takes some work, but also there are so many great intermediaries and groups lifting up all of these kinds of community groups. You can find a lot of them if you just do some searches and use groups like EGA and TFN to find out what your peer funders are funding. Even Bar Foundation has their database online. You can search and see all the groups they're funding. So I use the online tools a lot. I go back to the EGA database and search, if I'm looking for like water and justice, or if I'm looking for, I check out and see who everybody else is funding and use that as a way too.
Which leads me to a question, if I can. Deval Patrick, I think, had the slogan, "Together is better." I wonder if together is necessary in this type of work. And I'm thinking of is it necessary for funders who really want to be serious about this to collaborate with other funders and say join EGA or get involved in stuff you're doing? Is that really important? Similarly, in the nonprofit field, we have a lot of great standalones, including a lot of startups that we're going to look at. But then you have these collaborative efforts like the Green Justice Coalition. Is it important to work together in this field particularly?
I think it's definitely important to, I mean, you know, no matter how much money you have as a private funder, you know, the resources are tiny compared to the need and the scope of the challenge that's out there. But working with other funders is also an opportunity to sort of learn from them, kind of share and strategize together, see how different practices are being implemented in different places. I mean, I think there's a great value in that. I mean, with our Partners for Places grant program, we have a review committee that's both sustainability directors, local funders, and national funders. And you know, every time we go through a review, everyone has a different take on how they think about it, and we learn from sort of the collective wisdom in the group. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's incredibly important. And I think I used to work for a foundation a million years ago that doesn't exist now because of the Madoff scandals, but they were a little, you know, they were like, we're big, so we don't need other people, and we're nimble, so like we don't even need, you know, affinity groups and you know, we can do it all alone. And then the Madoff thing came, and we went from 40 million giving out a year to zero in a number of months. And actually, it was the partners that we did work with who actually took on our dockets. So like, you know, Open Society Foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies, and folks just came in, and like, it was that collaboration that, like, for me, I had the democracy docket there. I had an $8 million docket that I had just told everyone their grants were approved. And I had to call them all back and tell them not only were their grants not happening, but like the whole foundation was closing. But all of those grantees were picked up by those collaborative philanthropic partners because we had relationships, because I didn't believe what the ED was saying and that we were so great alone. When neither did he in practice. So like, I think it's important to know that we all are better when we're working in collaboration and in partnership. And when I'm doing funding now, I try to fund the both and. So like, we just gave a grant to the Gulf South for the Green New Deal group that does community. The community is picking who the grantees are. So, and then at the same time, we're doing Green New Deal funding in Ithaca, where we're trying to get folks to work together more. And so, you know, it depends on the situation, but it's always better in collaboration, I believe. And so joining EGA is great too, or TFN, because I mean, even just the retreat that I went to last week for EGA, I mean, just in my notebook, I have like 2 new impact investing ideas to bring back to the trustees around our investment side. I have like 2 new grantees that look pretty exciting to me. And then just learning from my peers, there was a whole session on energy and democracy funding together. That's something that we have been thinking about, how to get out of our own silos, where we have a democracy program and then we have like an environment and water program, and how do we connect those better. And so anyway, though, it's just important to keep learning and be humble.
Yeah, I think we have time for one final question. If anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask, now is the time. Okay, well,
I think Lavinia wanted to speak up.
Oh,
no.
No? I did have a question if Lavinia does not. And I know that this is kind of like, okay, all the work we're doing in this fund, but in the Boston area, and since you are here, and we're talking about this capacity building on the local level, you know, funder networks are one thing, but what do you see as the collaborative engine among the smaller nonprofits that are working at the community level that might have the community connections, but not necessarily the environmental focus? Have you seen any strong glue locally, working for the environment?
To tell you the truth, I'm mostly focused on national work
Oh,
at
okay,
this
okay,
point
I
in
just thought,
time, but I was going
yeah.
to say, you know, I mean, you've got some, I mean, even the Green Justice Coalition, you've got, you know, like the work of Neighbor to Neighbor, Community Labor United, I mean, Green Roots, I mean, there's some really exciting work that's going on. And my perspective on that, having been on the board of the Environmental League of Massachusetts, is also that there's a lot of kind of coalition work that's happening, and alliance work. And I know there's also a kind of New England version of the Green New Deal and sort of Massachusetts version of the Green New Deal. And then, you know, I was very involved in the creation of the New England Grassroots Environment Fund. So I would say that, you know, a group like the Grassroots Fund is helping do a lot of that capacity building and getting at a level of funding that a lot of bigger foundations really can't. And that was really why NEGF was created in the first place, you know, many moons ago. So I would also take a look at that and talk about capacity building. I think what they're doing there is really cool, where they're inviting outside reviewers to come on and review proposals and sort of build their own skill set as part of that. So even thinking about those kinds of approaches, I think there's real value.
Yeah, thank you.
And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and experience. This was a wonderful session. I hope that you'll stay in touch.
Well, thank you. And I hope you guys make some good grants.
Yeah, go make some good grants. It's exciting.
All right.
Thanks for your help.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Okay, I guess we're getting into the strategy part, and let me see. I was just talking, Liz, with Judy ahead of time, and we thought it would be important to really take this opportunity to get any funder input we can right off the bat. And is Myron still here, or
Looks like he had to go.
yet to go? Okay, but we have Kelton and we have Lavinia, and I think, you know, just in terms of what you would like to get out of this grant making process would be interesting. I'll just give you kind of an update on the calendar. Our next session, when we're going to make these grants, and we have 160,000 to give away, will be on November 9th. And we will mail out a list of organizations for consideration by the end of October, and try to get some kind of funder response through the mail by November 5th, so that we'll at least have a sense of where the energy is. And this will involve this wider circle, and we'll try to really track down every funder participant. But Liz has you know, some kind of tactical things to consider. I have one tactical thing to consider, but I'm just, you know, I'd be curious to know what your impressions were from this whole series, and what would make a great portfolio of grants for you. I mean, how do you think we can best use our resources here? And so I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to share, please do.
I have a question. Okay. The list you shared, I think I don't know, did the email come today? Is that just sort of a preliminary list that you're working on?
Yes, and we'll get to this shortly. It's an incomplete list, I've noticed too. There's one organization, the Mystic River Watershed Association, which two funders have sort of forwarded as you know, a strong one. But we'll get to that shortly.
And if you want to add
Liz,
any help in that,
I don't know if you would like to. Yes.
Okay. That's helpful to know. Thank you.
Liz, I thought your script was great and it would be good, but I guess there's one thing I'd really love to take away from today, just for internal operations. Say you have $160,000. Our normal approach to this funder community has been to make large signature grants of, say, in this case, 4 times 40,000. And that is one approach. Another approach is to take a more balanced portfolio and say, maybe make 8 grants of 20,000. Then you would have a sort of a story to share with other funders, which I think is the motivating factor behind all of this. We want to show people best in class, or we want to show people a really coherent portfolio of best in class. So, you know, a small group of grantees or a somewhat larger group of grantees, do people have any preference here? I mean, we can sort this out on our own, but I think it's good to have that general sense of direction. Lavinia.
Yeah, I feel so like a beginner in all of this, and I've tried to listen and tried to miss the last one I had to, but and Shaft, as you know, is doing the retreat next week. I don't think this is going to come up in a big way, but I would like to bring it up and talk about it a little bit. But I think for us to get into this whole field, we're going to have to do research and understanding and look at various groups. So I think more is better. In other words, well, Phil has already given these people some money and these people some money and these people some money. That will give us a feeling that this is what we should look into. We should find out about this. And so I think if that's your question, a couple big ones or some smaller ones, I'd go for the smaller ones.
And maybe a group of 8 sort of great grantees. I think we now have a short list of 15 or so. But Liz, why don't you take it away from here? I think you had this pretty well organized. So why don't we just go through this?
Nancy, did I see you nodding in agreement with that approach, doing slightly smaller grants?
I think the trustees would rather have smaller grants to reach more nonprofits.
Okay, great.
We make
So
large grants on our own, so
Mhm.
this is like a small grants program.
Okay, thanks for sharing. So it sounds like the folks on the line are in agreement, so we can follow up with the other participants as well.
I like that perspective, Nancy, that you already do the larger grants and that this is this opportunity to do smaller. I'm going to share the screen and I hope I'm sharing the right screen right now. Do you see Environmental Justice Fund?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then I will play from the start. Liz, did you have comments on this, or is this, yeah, I'll let you just tell me when next.
Yep, just to say that, you know, we've made it through all 4 of our learning sessions and it's gone by so fast, but here we are. And as Phil mentioned, our 5th and final session is on November 9th, when we'll be actually discussing the funding decisions. So we have a lot of work to do between now and then. And you could go to the next slide, please, Judy. GMA will be working on that list of prospective nonprofits. If you do have any groups that you would like to add, please email one of us as soon as possible so we can include them in our review. GMA will be working on the grant recommendations. So we'll take all of the information from our discussion today and what we've learned over the last 4 sessions, and also rather stealthily, I hope, gather data on the nonprofits to come up with executive summaries of each organization for your review by the end of October. These are 1 to 2 page executive summaries that provide background information on each organization, including its leadership, financial health, an overview of programming, and the funding recommendation. We'll also highlight exemplary work, expertise in the field, and alignment with the funding criteria, which you see on the screen now. If there's any additional information that you'd like to know about these nonprofits, feel free to say so now. Anything in particular that you'd like to know? Okay. So moving into the funding criteria itself, I believe this was circulated last week and perhaps also again today. This is the criteria that the GMA team has put together. So we'll be looking for organizations that have expertise in environmental justice issues, as well as awareness of unique opportunities and challenges that are in good financial health and standing, have leadership that's representative of the communities that they serve, and also are thought leaders in creative organizations. We're also looking for groups that are at a moment of inflection where funding and visibility could really help catapult their work, and that they have the ability to adopt a collaborative cross-sector approach. This is a draft. We'd be very happy to get your feedback on this if there are other factors that you think we should be considering as we move forward into reviewing the nonprofits. If you think of anything later, feel free to email Judy, Phil, or myself, and we can make sure that's included. Judy, I think we could move to the next one. Okay, so this is the short list of nonprofits for consideration. Again, this is tentative, so if you have any additions or any particular reason that you think one of these groups should not be considered, just let us know.
And I'll just say a little bit about this list. A lot of this has come from direct experience with our own clients here, and it's a somewhat of a motley list. But I think if you wanted to create buckets, I mean, there's the advocacy groups, which would include ACE and the Green Justice Coalition, perhaps Green Roots, Lawyers Committee, starting up a new department, maybe Mothers Out Front, Neighbor to Neighbor. Then you have community-based groups. These buckets are not clean, but Boston Food Forest, which was just supported by the Riley Foundation, the Harbor Keepers, Codman Square, which spoke to us and which has a neighborhood-based approach. Mystic River is really working on community. Speak for the Trees, a startup. We have a couple that are really focused on food, the Boston Area Gleaners, and it has some environmental implications. Commonwealth Kitchen, ditto. I think there are some national organizations tucked in here. Neighbor to Neighbor, I believe, operates nationally, and I think Mothers Out Front does. And then there is this one coalition, the Green Justice Coalition, which includes some of these organizations above. So, you know, there are themes, but it's not exactly the most strategic list in the world. And I think what the challenge will be if we do a portfolio approach is to come up with a group of grantees that really tells a story. I'll tell you the other outlier that came from a client of ours, the Babson Foundation, is the Native Land Conservancy. And that is an outlier, but it's an interesting one. And it's, again, part of a national movement to return land to Indigenous people. It's happening on the South Coast.
Hmm.
Does anyone have any quick reactions to this list?
I would just add that in the emails we sent last week and then repeated this morning, these are all hyperlinked thanks to my colleague Sarah Kane. And I, for one, can't wait to just go click on all the links and read about them because they are small, kind of niche organizations that are doing really interesting work. So.
What's next?
I'm stopping the share and Liz will tell you what's next.
That's really it for our discussion today. If you have any comments, we could have a conversation. Any ideas that you might have about the nonprofits we're suggesting or on the executive summaries before we dig in and start doing that work, that would be very helpful to hear. Otherwise, we can be adjourned.
I could just say, again, my immediate reaction is, I don't want to invest in something that's national. I think we start this out. That would be but that would just be two that you looked at.
Mhm.
That
How do
more
others feel?
locals are better, I think.
I
Sure.
agree.
Okay, that's really helpful criteria to take into consideration.